Money buys power, silence, and obedience. Silence usually follows when billionaires erupt in anger inside Michelin-starred restaurants. Diners freeze, managers apologize profusely, waitstaff tremble. Arthur Pendleton expected exactly that reaction after throwing a glass of vintage Cabernet across a white tablecloth, screaming at a young server for a minor mistake. He anticipated fear. He demanded submission. Instead, a quiet, devastating sentence shattered his reality. One string of words stripped away his wealth, his arrogance, and his untouchable status. Everyone watching stopped breathing. It wasn't an insult. It was a revelation so deeply personal, his empire suddenly meant nothing. High above the bustling, rain-slicked streets of Chicago, L'Étoile Noire sat perched like a crown jewel on the 45th floor of the city's most exclusive skyscraper. It was a restaurant that did not merely serve food, it served status. The dining room was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, glittering view of Lake Michigan. Dark mahogany tables spaced meticulously apart to ensure absolute privacy, and chandeliers crafted from hand-blown Venetian glass that cast a warm, golden glow over the evening's elite clientele. A reservation here required a 6-month wait, unless, of course, a guest possessed a net worth that allowed them to bypass the rules of ordinary society. Abigail Preston understood the rules of L'Étoile Noire better than anyone. At 31 years old, she was a veteran of the high-end hospitality industry, a woman who had spent the better part of her adult life moving silently through rooms filled with individuals whose hourly income eclipsed her yearly salary. She was exceptionally good at her job. She knew how to anticipate a guest's needs before they even realized they had them. She knew exactly when to approach a table and when to render herself completely invisible. She moved with a practiced, elegant grace, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, flawless chignon, her uniform crisp and perfectly tailored. Yet, beneath her polished exterior, Abigail was drowning. The reality of her life outside the restaurant was a stark, brutal contrast to the luxury she navigated every night. Her mother, deeply afflicted by early-onset Alzheimer's, required full-time residential care, the cost of which was an ever-tightening noose around Abigail's neck. Every shift, every grueling double, every forced smile directed at a demanding socialite was a means of survival. She did not work for passion. She worked to keep a roof over her mother's head. She was exhausted, living on a dangerous mixture of caffeine, sheer willpower, and the desperate hope that her next paycheck would clear her outstanding debts. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the pre-service briefing began. General Manager Charles Harrington, a high-strung man with thinning hair and a permanent sheen of nervous sweat on his forehead, stood before the assembled waitstaff in the private dining room. Charles viewed his role not as a manager, but as a general leading troops into a high-stakes war, where a single dropped spoon could mean total annihilation. "Listen up, everyone," Charles announced, his voice tight with anxiety, as he tapped a freshly printed reservations list. "Tonight is not a standard Tuesday. We have a fully booked floor, but more importantly, we have a catastrophic risk sitting at Table 7. A murmur rippled through the staff. Table 7 was the prime real estate of the dining room, a semi-private alcove offering the best views and absolute isolation. Arthur Pendleton. Charles read the name as if uttering a curse. He is dining with 2 senior partners from his firm. For those of you who do not read the Financial Times, Mr. Pendleton is the Chief Executive Officer of Pendleton Global Holdings. He is currently orchestrating one of the largest, most aggressive corporate takeovers in the history of the Midwest. He is known to be utterly ruthless in boardrooms, and his reputation in restaurants is significantly worse. Abigail felt a strange, cold flutter in her stomach at the mention of the name, Arthur Pendleton. She knew exactly who he was, and not from the financial papers. "Pendleton is notoriously difficult," Charles continued, pacing the length of the room. "He has blacklisted 3 different restaurants in Manhattan simply because he didn't like the ambient temperature. He is demanding, he is arrogant, and he will look for any excuse to exert his dominance. You will not make eye contact unless addressed. You will not interrupt his conversation. The wine must flow continuously, but you must pour it as if you are a ghost." "Abigail!" Charles stopped pacing and pointed directly at her. "You are on table 7. You are my most composed server. Do not let me down." "Yes, Mr. Harrington," Abigail replied evenly, her voice giving nothing away. As the staff dispersed to finalize their stations, Abigail walked over to table 7. She meticulously adjusted the silver cutlery, ensuring each knife and fork was precisely aligned with the edge of the table. She polished the heavy crystal water glasses until they caught the light perfectly. Her hands were steady, but her mind was racing. Arthur Pendleton was a titan of industry, a man who bought struggling legacy companies, stripped them of their assets, fired thousands of workers, and sold off the remnants for staggering personal profit. He was a predator in a bespoke Italian suit. But Abigail knew something else about him, something deeply intimate, something that Charles Harrington, the financial papers, and even Arthur Pendleton's own board of directors did not fully understand. A year ago, Arthur Pendleton had disappeared from the public eye for 6 months. The official corporate statement claimed he was taking a well-deserved sabbatical on his private estate in the Hamptons. The truth, hidden behind layers of non-disclosure agreements and private medical staff, was that Arthur had been dying. He had been diagnosed with an aggressive, late-stage form of leukemia. His vast wealth had bought him the best oncologists on the planet, but all the money in his accounts could not buy him a genetic match. He needed a bone marrow transplant, and he needed it urgently. Abigail had been on the National Bone Marrow Registry since she was 18. When she received the call that she was a rare, perfect match for an anonymous patient in desperate need, she had not hesitated. The procedure was painful, leaving her sidelined from work for weeks, burying her further in debt. But she had done it because it was the right thing to do. It was only months later, through a highly unusual clerical error involving a misrouted insurance billing statement that slipped through the hospital's privacy firewall, that she discovered the identity of the man whose life she had saved. She had saved Arthur Pendleton. She had given her literal lifeblood to a man who made his fortune destroying the lives of others. As the clock struck 6, the heavy mahogany doors of L'Étoile Noire opened, and the evening began. Abigail stood at her station, smoothing her apron, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. The man who carried her marrow in his bones was about to walk into her domain, and she was going to serve him dinner. Arthur Pendleton arrived at exactly 7:30. He did not walk into the restaurant. He invaded it. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with silver hair meticulously slicked back and a sharp, aristocratic face that seemed permanently set in a sneer of disdain. He wore a charcoal grey suit that easily cost more than a luxury car. Flanking him were 2 younger, equally sharply dressed men, Harrison Croft, his lead legal counsel, and Silas Wentworth, a junior executive desperate for Arthur's approval. The moment Arthur crossed the threshold, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Diners at nearby tables instinctively lowered their voices. Charles Harrington practically sprinted across the floor, bowing with a level of obsequiousness that made Abigail's stomach turn. "Mr. Pendleton, an absolute honor to welcome you to L'Étoile Noire," Charles gushed, leading the trio toward table 7. We have prepared our finest table for you. The chef sends his absolute best." Arthur did not even look at Charles. He simply handed his cashmere overcoat to a waiting hostess without breaking his stride. "I expect the service to be faster than last time, Charles. I have a transatlantic call at 10, and I will not be delayed because your kitchen lacks discipline." "Of course, sir. Absolutely, sir," Charles stammered, pulling out Arthur's chair. Abigail approached the table gracefully, carrying a tray with 3 flutes of complimentary vintage champagne. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said softly. "Welcome to—" "We don't need the rehearsed greeting," Arthur cut her off, waving his hand dismissively. He didn't look at her face. He looked straight through her. "Bring a bottle of the 2009 Louis Roederer Cristal. And I don't want the sommelier giving me a history lesson. Just open it and pour it." "Right away, sir," Abigail replied, pivoting smoothly and retreating to the service station. The dinner began as a masterclass in tension. Abigail executed every movement with flawless precision, but Arthur was in a foul, predatory mood. From the snippets of conversation she overheard while pouring wine and clearing plates, it became clear why. The corporate takeover he was engineering was facing pushback from a local labor union. The resistance infuriated him. "These people are insects," Arthur snarled, slicing into his Wagyu beef carpaccio with unnecessary force. "They think a strike is going to stop me from liquidating the manufacturing plant? I'll bankrupt their pension fund by Friday. I want them bleeding by the time they come back to the negotiating table, Harrison. Make sure of it." "We are drafting the injunctions now, Arthur," Harrison replied nervously, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. "But the optics—" "I don't care about optics," Arthur snapped, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet alcove. "I care about the bottom line. Empathy is a disease for the poor, Harrison. Never forget that." Abigail stood at her station 10 feet away, her face a mask of professional neutrality, but beneath her uniform, her skin crawled. She watched the man who was alive only because of her sacrifice sitting there, actively planning the financial ruin of hundreds of families. He was vibrating with arrogance, drunk on his own perceived invincibility. The courses progressed, the caviar service, the seared foie gras. With every interaction, Arthur's microaggressions toward Abigail escalated. He complained that the ice water was too cold, demanding a fresh glass. He scoffed when she presented the main course, muttering loudly to Silas about the incompetent, uneducated staff holding society back. Abigail absorbed every insult, refusing to let her composure crack. She was a professional. The catalyst occurred during the presentation of the final savory course, a delicate wild mushroom risotto infused with white truffle oil. Abigail approached the table, balancing the heavy porcelain plates. She served Silas, then Harrison, and finally placed the dish gently in front of Arthur. As she leaned in to grate a fresh shaving of black truffle over the steaming dish, a single, minuscule drop of condensation from the chilled metal grater detached itself and fell. It did not hit Arthur. It did not hit his suit. It landed silently on the extreme outer rim of the wide porcelain plate. It was a nothing event, an invisible infraction. But Arthur Pendleton, frustrated by his pending business deal and looking for a target to destroy, locked his eyes onto that tiny drop of water. He slowly put down his fork. The silence at the table became deafening. "What?" Arthur whispered, his voice dangerously low. "Is this?" Abigail paused, stepping back and clasping her hands behind her back. "Sir, are you blind as well as stupid?" Arthur's voice began to rise in volume. He pointed a manicured finger at the rim of the plate. "You dripped water onto my dish. You contaminated a $300 plate of food with your careless, clumsy hands." "I apologize, Mr. Pendleton," Abigail said evenly, keeping her voice incredibly calm to de-escalate the situation. "I will have the kitchen prepare a fresh plate for you immediately." She reached out to take the plate away, but Arthur suddenly slammed his hand down on the table. The crystal glasses rattled violently. The sharp crack of his palm against the wood cut through the ambient jazz playing softly in the restaurant. "Do not touch it," Arthur roared, standing up abruptly. His chair scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. The entire dining room froze. Conversations at neighboring tables died instantly. Forks halted mid-air. Wealthy patrons turned their heads, their eyes wide with shock. A billionaire throwing a tantrum was a spectacle they could not look away from. "You think you can just whisk it away and hide your incompetence?" Arthur shouted, stepping toward Abigail. He was attempting to use his physical size to intimidate her, towering over her. "This is the problem with your kind. You demand a minimum wage, you demand respect, but you have absolutely zero dedication to excellence. You are a glorified plate carrier, a replaceable drone who cannot even manage the simple, mindless task of serving food without ruining it." "Mr. Pendleton, please," Harrison Croft whispered frantically, looking around at the staring crowd. "People are looking." "Let them look," Arthur bellowed, his face flushing red with rage. He turned back to Abigail, his eyes filled with absolute contempt. "You are worthless. People like you exist merely to serve people like me, and you can't even do that right. You are a failure in an apron." With a sudden, violent sweep of his arm, Arthur hit the edge of the risotto plate. The heavy porcelain flew off the table, shattering loudly against the floor. Thick, creamy risotto splattered across the polished wood and onto the hem of Abigail's uniform. The sharp crash of breaking ceramic echoed through the silent restaurant like a gunshot. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in L'Étoile Noire was the faint, tinny rhythm of the jazz track playing over the hidden speakers. The atmosphere had turned to ice. At a table across the room, an older woman in a diamond necklace held her hand to her chest in genuine horror. A rival tech CEO sitting by the window watched with morbid fascination, slowly sipping his martini. General Manager Charles Harrington came sprinting out of the kitchen hallway, his face completely drained of color. He took one look at the shattered plate on the floor, the food staining Abigail's apron, and the towering, furious figure of Arthur Pendleton, and instantly went into survival mode. "Mr. Pendleton, good God, sir, I am so profoundly sorry." Charles practically threw himself between Arthur and Abigail, bowing frantically. "This is completely unacceptable. I am mortified. Please, sir, sit down. I will handle this immediately." Arthur remained standing, his chest heaving, a cruel, triumphant smile beginning to form on his lips. He had taken his frustration out on someone beneath him, and it felt intoxicating. He felt powerful. "You will fire her, Charles," Arthur commanded, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent room. "You will fire her this exact second, and you will ensure she never works in this city again. I want her gone before I sit back down." Charles didn't even hesitate. He turned to Abigail, his eyes pleading with her to just accept it and leave so he could save the restaurant's reputation. "Abigail, give me your apron. Go to the office. You're done here." Abigail stood perfectly still. She looked down at the ruined food at her feet, then up at Charles, and finally her gaze locked onto Arthur Pendleton. Arthur expected tears. He expected her to crumble, to apologize profusely, to beg for her livelihood, as he had seen so many broken executives do in his boardrooms. He fed on the desperation of others. But as he stared into Abigail's dark eyes, he saw something that deeply unsettled him. He didn't see fear. He didn't see humiliation. He saw a terrifying, absolute calm. Abigail did not reach for her apron. Instead, she took a single, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between herself and the billionaire. The air around them seemed to crackle with tension. Charles reached out to stop her, whispering, "Abigail, don't." But she ignored him completely. She looked at Arthur, studying his flushed face, the silver hair, the pulsing vein in his neck. She thought about her father's devastated town. She thought about her mother sitting in a sterile room, forgetting her own daughter's name. And she thought about the agonizing weeks she spent in a hospital bed, needles in her hips, harvesting her marrow for a faceless stranger who turned out to be a monster. The universe had placed him right in front of her. He had demanded submission. He was about to receive the exact opposite. "You think you are untouchable, Mr. Pendleton," Abigail said. Her voice was not loud. It wasn't a shout. But in the absolute, pin-drop silence of the dining room, her quiet, steady tone cut through the air like a scalpel. It was so completely devoid of fear that Arthur actually blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the sheer authority in her tone. "Excuse me?" Arthur scoffed, though his voice lacked its previous thunder. "How dare you speak to me? Charles, get security." "Shut up, Charles," Abigail said, not breaking eye contact with Arthur. Charles Harrington froze, utterly paralyzed by the sudden shift in power dynamics. Abigail took another half-step forward, forcing Arthur to actually look down at her. "Last December you disappeared for 6 months, Arthur," Abigail said, her voice carrying a chilling clarity that reached the closest tables. Arthur's posture stiffened immediately. The arrogant sneer vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, sharp flash of alarm. His medical history was a fiercely guarded corporate secret. If the market knew how close he had been to death, his stock would have plummeted. Harrison Croft, the lawyer, half stood from his chair, his eyes wide. "You spent $2 million on private investigators trying to find the anonymous donor who gave you the bone marrow transplant that cured your stage 4 lymphoma," Abigail continued, every word landing like a physical blow. "You wanted to find them so you could buy their silence, to make sure no one ever knew that the great Arthur Pendleton was weak, dying, and entirely dependent on the charity of a stranger." Arthur's face turned an ashen, sickly grey. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He stared at the waitress in the stained apron, his mind desperately rejecting what he was hearing, even as the horrifying reality began to set in. Abigail leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a harsh, intimate whisper that still somehow echoed in the dead, silent room. "My name is Abigail Preston. I am the woman whose blood is currently keeping you alive," she said, her eyes boring into his soul. "I gave you my marrow because I thought every human life was worth saving. But watching you tonight, seeing the pathetic, cruel little man you truly are..." She paused, letting the silence hang heavy and suffocating over the table. "I finally regret saving your life." The absolute stillness in L'Étoile Noire was deafening. Arthur Pendleton stood frozen, his sharp, aristocratic features twisting into an expression of profound horror. The color had drained so completely from his face that the silver of his hair seemed to blend into his skin. His mind, usually a steel trap of calculations and hostile strategies, flatlined. He stared at Abigail Preston, the waitress in the stained apron, desperately searching her dark, unwavering eyes for a lie. He found none. He saw only the cold, hard truth of a woman who had given him a second chance at life, only to realize he was entirely unworthy of the gift. You are lying," Arthur stammered. It was the first time in 3 decades that Harrison Croft, his lead counsel, had ever heard the billionaire's voice tremble. "This is extortion. This is a pathetic, fabricated attempt to..." "To what, Arthur?" Abigail interrupted, her voice remaining impossibly calm, a stark contrast to his rising panic. To get a better tip? To save a job I despise? She gestured casually toward the shattered porcelain and the ruined risotto on the floor. I know about the private clinic in Zurich you visited when the first rounds of chemotherapy failed. I know you registered under the alias Robert Palmer to hide your failing health from your shareholders. I know your blood type changed to O negative after the transplant. My blood type. A collective, barely audible gasp rippled through the surrounding tables. Phones previously resting next to wine glasses were now discreetly angled toward table 7. The tiny red lights of recording cameras blinked in the dim, romantic lighting of the restaurant. Harrison Croft finally snapped out of his shock. His legal instincts, honed by years of burying Arthur's scandals, kicked in. He bolted upright, nearly knocking over his chair, and stepped between his boss and the waitress. "Miss, I strongly advise you to stop speaking," Harrison said, his tone low, threatening, and laced with legal peril. "You are violating profound medical confidentiality laws. You are slandering a public figure. By tomorrow morning, I will have you buried under so many injunctions and lawsuits you won't be able to breathe, let alone work." Abigail didn't flinch. She slowly shifted her gaze from Arthur's pale face to the lawyer. "I am the donor, Mr. Croft," Abigail stated clearly. "HIPAA laws protect the patient from the medical establishment leaking their records. They do not prohibit a donor from talking about their own body, their own marrow, and their own choices. I signed no non-disclosure agreement with Pendleton Global Holdings because Arthur's investigators couldn't find me to force me into signing one. The hospital shielded my identity perfectly. I found him through a billing error that your own bloated accounting department failed to catch." She leaned slightly to the side, ensuring she maintained eye contact with Arthur, who had sunk back into his chair, looking suddenly hollow and frail, a ghost of the tyrant who had been screaming just 3 minutes prior. "You can sue me for the cost of the broken plate, Arthur," Abigail said, her voice dripping with finality. "But you cannot sue me for telling the truth. You are alive because I laid in a hospital bed for a week, in agonizing pain, believing I was saving a good person." She reached behind her back, untied the crisp white strings of her apron, and pulled it over her head. She dropped the heavy, stained fabric directly onto the spilled risotto at Arthur's feet. "Consider my resignation effective immediately, Charles," Abigail said, without looking at the trembling restaurant manager. She turned on her heel and walked away. She did not run. She did not look back. She walked with the steady, measured pace of a woman who had just dropped a bomb and had absolutely no interest in watching the explosion. The heavy mahogany doors of L'Étoile Noire opened for her, and she vanished into the Chicago night. Back at table 7, the silence shattered. Whispers erupted across the dining room like a sudden downpour. Silas Wentworth, the junior executive, sat paralyzed, clutching his linen napkin. Harrison was frantically dialing a number on his cell phone, already barking orders to a crisis management team. Arthur remained seated, staring blankly at the crumpled apron on the floor. The ambient jazz music swelled, mocking the utter devastation of his carefully constructed reality. His chest felt tight. The blood pumping through his veins, her blood, suddenly felt foreign, toxic, and heavy. He had built his entire empire on the perception of invulnerability. He was the apex predator of the corporate world, and a waitress making $20 an hour had just publicly gutted him. "Arthur," Harrison hissed, grabbing the billionaire's shoulder. "Arthur, we have to leave. Now. People are recording. We need to get ahead of this before the Asian markets open." Arthur nodded numbly. As he stood up, his knee brushed against the table, He didn't look arrogant anymore. He looked exactly like what he had been desperately trying to hide, a fragile, sick man living on borrowed time and borrowed bone marrow. He walked out of the restaurant, not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive fleeing the scene of his own execution. By 6 a.m. the following morning, the financial world was on fire. The video, a steady, high-definition recording taken from a neighboring table, had hit the internet before Arthur's chauffeured Maybach had even reached his penthouse. It was a catastrophic masterpiece of public relations failure. It perfectly captured the unhinged, elitist rage of a billionaire shattering a plate over a minor mistake, followed immediately by the cold, devastating revelation from the calm, composed waitress. The internet did not just react, it detonated. The hashtag borrowed bones was trending #1 globally. Labor unions across the country, already infuriated by Arthur's ruthless business practices, rallied behind Abigail's image. She became an overnight symbol of the working class, confronting the untouchable elite. But the social media outrage was merely a surface wound. The true hemorrhage was happening in the stock market. Inside the glass-walled boardroom of Pendleton Global Holdings, chaos reigned. The panoramic views of the sunrise over Lake Michigan were entirely ignored by the 12 board members, frantically reviewing plunging stock tickers on their tablets. Pendleton Global Holdings stock was in freefall, dropping 14% in pre-market trading alone. Arthur sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking 10 years older than he had the night before. His silver hair was slightly disheveled. Harrison Croft stood beside a digital whiteboard, desperately trying to project an air of control that no one in the room believed. The PR aspect is disastrous, but it is manageable, Harrison argued, his voice hoarse from hours of shouting at media outlets. We frame her as a disgruntled, unstable employee looking for a payout. We issue a calculated apology for the misunderstanding at the restaurant. Are you completely out of your mind, Harrison? Interrupted Richard Sterling, the oldest and most ruthless member of the board. Richard leaned forward, his eyes locked on Arthur with absolute venom. This isn't about him throwing a tantrum over a bowl of rice. This is about fiduciary duty and SEC regulations. Richard tapped his heavy gold pen against his tablet. Arthur, you had stage 4 lymphoma. You underwent a highly experimental, high-risk bone marrow transplant. You disappeared for 6 months, claiming you were on a sabbatical, while actively lying to the board, your shareholders, and the federal government about your health. If you had died during that procedure, this company would have collapsed overnight. I survived, Richard, Arthur growled, his voice a low, defensive rasp. I handled it privately to avoid precisely this kind of panic. You handled it by lying, Richard shot back. Your hostile takeover of the Midwestern manufacturing plants is predicated on your reputation as a relentless, unstoppable force. That image is dead. The labor union negotiating committee saw the video at midnight. They just walked away from the table. They know you are weak. They know the public is backing them. They are demanding a full halt to the liquidation, or they will strike across all 24 facilities. Arthur slammed his fist onto the table, a desperate echo of his behavior at the restaurant. They do not have the capital to sustain a strike. Crush them. We can't, another board member, a sharp-featured woman named Cynthia, interjected quietly. The banks called an hour ago, Arthur. They are pulling the financing for the takeover. They consider you a sudden, massive liability. A CEO who hid a terminal illness is a CEO who commits fraud. The SEC has already announced an emergency inquiry into our corporate disclosures. Arthur felt the room spinning slightly. The walls of his empire, constructed over decades of intimidation and flawless strategy were cracking at the foundation. He looked around the table, expecting to see the usual fear and deference he commanded. Instead, he saw sharks smelling blood in the water. His blood. "Find the girl," Arthur whispered, turning to Harrison, his eyes manic. "Find Abigail Preston. Offer her $5 million. $10 million. Whatever it takes. Have her sign a retraction. Have her say she fabricated the medical history to hurt me." Harrison looked at his boss with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "Arthur, we tracked her down 3 hours ago. We sent a team to her apartment with a blank check." Arthur's eyes lit up with a momentary flash of desperate hope. "And? How much did she want?" "Nothing," Harrison said softly, the word echoing in the tense boardroom. "She refused to open the door. She told the team to get off her property before she called the police. Arthur, she doesn't want your money. She doesn't want anything from you. She just wanted you to know exactly who you are." Richard Sterling stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with an air of absolute finality. "The board will convene for an emergency vote in 1 hour," Richard announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Arthur, I strongly suggest you use that time to draft your letter of resignation. If you do not step down voluntarily, we will remove you for gross violation of fiduciary duty. We cannot let your sudden vulnerability destroy this firm." Arthur sat frozen as the board members filed out of the room one by one, leaving him completely alone in the sprawling, luxurious suite. He looked down at his hands that had signed billion-dollar deals, hands that had ruined thousands of lives, hands that were currently shaking. He could feel the strong, steady pulse of his heart in his chest, a heart fueled by the blood of the woman he had tried to destroy. The hard, unbreakable Arthur Pendleton had finally met a force his money could not buy, a woman who simply did not care about his wealth, and it was going to cost him everything. The absolute precision of Arthur Pendleton's downfall was something financial analysts would study for decades. It did not happen slowly. It happened with the violent, unstoppable velocity of a severed elevator cable. At 9 a.m., precisely 1 hour after Richard Sterling's ultimatum, the board of Pendleton Global Holdings convened. The vote was unanimous. Arthur was stripped of his title as Chief Executive Officer, removed from the board of directors, and locked out of the company's internal servers before he could even return to his desk to collect his personal effects. When he stepped out of the private elevator into the main lobby of the Pendleton building, 2 armed corporate security guards, men whose salaries he used to sign, were waiting to escort him off the premises. He was marched out through the revolving glass doors, directly into a blinding swarm of paparazzi flashes and aggressive reporters. But the loss of his company was merely the first domino to fall in a devastating chain reaction of hard karma. By noon, the Securities and Exchange Commission formally announced a federal investigation into Arthur's tenure. The specific charge was severe: defrauding shareholders by actively concealing a terminal illness that materially affected the company's valuation. However, the true twist, the revelation that would legally bury him, emerged 3 days later from a source he never anticipated. Silas Wentworth, the junior executive who had sat trembling at table 7, saw the writing on the wall. Desperate to save his own career and avoid federal prison, Silas approached the Department of Justice with a proffer agreement. He handed over a cache of heavily encrypted emails detailing exactly how Arthur had found his anonymous bone marrow donor. Arthur had not just utilized a minor billing error. He had authorized the payment of $2.5 million in corporate funds to a shadowy private intelligence firm to illegally hack into the secure database of the National Marrow Donor Program. It was a massive, federal cybercrime, an egregious violation of medical privacy laws, and outright embezzlement of company money to serve his personal paranoia. When the Department of Justice unsealed the indictment on a rainy Tuesday morning, the federal judge immediately ordered Arthur's assets frozen. His bank accounts, his offshore trusts in the Cayman Islands, his sprawling estate in the Hamptons, and his Chicago penthouse were all seized by the government pending trial. In the span of a single week, the billionaire who had demanded absolute obedience from the world was rendered entirely impotent. He was restricted to a secondary property, a sterile, mid-range condominium his lawyers managed to secure, wearing a GPS ankle monitor, forbidden from leaving the state of Illinois. Conversely, the universe had entirely different plans for Abigail Preston. The video of the incident at L'Étoile Noire had transcended viral status. It had become a cultural touchstone. The public, exhausted by tales of untouchable corporate greed, rallied around the calm, unwavering waitress who had spoken truth to power. Within 48 hours of her resignation, the local chapter of the manufacturing union that Arthur had been trying to destroy launched a verified crowdfunding campaign in Abigail's name. The organizers, rugged men and women who had watched Arthur threaten their pensions, simply titled the page, "For the woman who gave him life, while he tried to take ours." The response was staggering. Small donations of $5 and $10 poured in from waitstaff, nurses, teachers, and factory workers across the globe. Then, heavier hitters stepped in. Anonymous tech entrepreneurs, rival CEOs whom Arthur had crossed in the past, and prominent philanthropists began dropping five-figure sums. In less than 10 days, the fund surpassed $4 million. Abigail watched the numbers climb on her laptop screen from her small, cramped apartment, tears streaming down her face. She didn't buy a sports car. She didn't buy a mansion. The very first wire transfer she authorized went directly to Oakwood Memory Care, the premium residential facility she had desperately wanted for her mother. She paid for 10 years of round-the-clock, specialized care in advance. The crushing, suffocating weight of debt that had dictated every miserable shift at the restaurant evaporated overnight. Furthermore, she was not left to fight Arthur's lingering legal threats alone. The highest-profile civil rights and labor law firm in Chicago took her on as a client, entirely pro bono. When Harrison Croft attempted to send a hollow cease-and-desist letter regarding the cyber-hacking revelations, Abigail's new legal team responded with a countersuit for extreme emotional distress, invasion of privacy, and harassment that made the evening news. Harrison Croft, realizing his own law license was on the line for complicity in the hacking cover-up, quietly resigned as Arthur's counsel the very next day. Arthur was bleeding out. Not from his illness, but from his own hubris. And the ultimate twist of his torment was deeply, inescapably biological. The stress of the indictment, the freezing of his assets, and the public humiliation began to take a catastrophic physical toll. Because his funds were seized by the federal government, Arthur could no longer afford the exorbitant retainer for his private, concierge medical team in Switzerland. He was forced to transition his complex post-transplant care to a standard, local oncologist assigned by the court-approved insurance policy his defense team managed to salvage. He found himself sitting in a crowded, sterile waiting room at a public hospital, surrounded by the exact everyday people he had spent his life stepping on. He had to take a numbered ticket. He had to wait for hours. When his blood was drawn, he was forced to look at the vials and remember the terrifying reality. The immune system currently fighting off the ambient infections in this very waiting room did not belong to him. It belonged to the woman he had berated over a drop of water. His body was not rejecting the marrow, but his mind was fracturing under the weight of it. Every time his heart beat, it was a rhythmic, drumming reminder of Abigail Preston. She was the ghost in his machine, the savior he had tried to slaughter. The Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago was a towering monolith of steel and glass, designed to make anyone who entered it feel small and insignificant. For Arthur Pendleton, a man who had spent his entire adult life making others feel exactly that way, the architecture felt like a personal insult. The courtroom on the 22nd floor was aggressively air-conditioned, the chill biting through the thin, off-the-rack navy blazer Arthur now wore. The bespoke charcoal suits woven from Italian wool were gone, seized along with his luxury properties, his offshore accounts, and his fleet of vehicles. The man sitting at the defense table was a hollowed-out shell of the titan who had once terrorized the financial district. His silver hair, once thick and styled to project aristocratic authority, was now dull, thinning, and entirely grey. His skin carried a permanent, sickly pallor. The jury had been deliberating for a mere 3.5 hours. In federal court, a swift deliberation was the ultimate death knell for the defense. Arthur's court-appointed attorney, an exhausted public defender who clearly harbored a deep disdain for white-collar criminals, sat silently next to him, shuffling papers. When the heavy wooden doors of the jury room clicked open, the suffocating tension in the room snapped tight. Has the jury reached a verdict? The presiding judge, the Honorable Marcus Caldwell, a man known for his merciless sentencing in corporate fraud cases, asked, his voice echoing off the oak-panelled walls. "We have, Your Honor," the forewoman replied, her voice steady and loud. Arthur stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. He refused to look at the gallery, which was packed with reporters, former employees he had fired, and union representatives who had come to watch the monster fall. On count 1, wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud, the forewoman read, unfolding the verdict sheet. We find the defendant, Arthur Pendleton, guilty. Arthur did not flinch, but a cold sweat broke out across the back of his neck. On count 2, unauthorized access to a protected computer system and severe violation of federal medical privacy statutes, guilty. On counts 3 through 7, securities fraud and willful concealment of material facts from shareholders, guilty. The word repeated, striking him like physical blows. Guilty. 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 There was no sudden outburst in the courtroom. There was no dramatic gasp from the gallery. There was only the heavy, absolute finality of a man's empire being ground into dust by the wheels of justice. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, folding his hands over his gavel. He looked down at Arthur, not with anger, but with profound, surgical disgust. "Mr. Pendleton," the judge began, his voice cutting through the silence. "In my 2 decades on the federal bench, I have seen men steal to feed their families. I have seen men driven to crime by addiction, desperation, and systemic failure. You possess none of those excuses. You were granted every privilege this world has to offer. You had unimaginable wealth. And yet, when faced with your own mortality, you didn't find humility. You found a new way to be monstrous." Arthur swallowed hard, the dry click audible in his own ears. "You weaponized your wealth to illegally hack into the National Marrow Donor Program, violating the sanctity of a system built on pure human altruism," Judge Caldwell continued, his words falling like stones. "You stole the privacy of the very woman who endured immense physical pain to save your life. And you did it simply because you believed your status exempted you from the rules of human decency. The irony, Mr. Pendleton, is that your body rejected the illness, but your character remained entirely malignant." The judge adjusted his glasses, looking at the sentencing guidelines matrix on his screen. It is the judgment of this court that you serve a term of 96 months in a high-security federal correctional institution. You are ordered to pay complete restitution, liquidating any and all remaining assets, and you are barred for life from serving as an officer or director of any public company. Court is adjourned. The loud crack of the gavel was the sound of the vault door closing on Arthur's life. Over the next 3 weeks, pending his self-surrender date, Arthur was confined to a sterile 2-bedroom condominium in a lower-middle-class suburb, forced to wear an unyielding GPS ankle monitor that chafed against his skin. His reality shrank from global boardrooms to 4 beige walls. He spent his days sitting in a cheap recliner, staring at his phone. He dialed number after number: former political allies, billionaire associates, golfing partners, the men who used to laugh at his cruel jokes and drink his vintage champagne. No one answered. Not a single person. The silence was agonizing. He had spent his life believing he was respected, but the cold truth was that he was only ever feared. Without his money to act as a shield and a weapon, he was nothing to them. He was a liability. He was infectious. Meanwhile, halfway across the city, the universe was busy balancing the scales with brilliant, undeniable light. Abigail Preston stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel, the crystal chandeliers casting a warm, golden glow over the sold-out crowd. She was not wearing a starched, stained uniform. She wore a stunning, tailored emerald green gown that perfectly complemented her dark hair. The room was packed with philanthropists, medical professionals, and everyday citizens who had donated to her cause. Behind her, a massive digital banner read, "The Preston Foundation, First Annual Gala." 2 years ago, I thought my life was entirely defined by debt and exhaustion. Abigail spoke into the microphone, her voice possessing a calm, mesmerizing authority that silenced the room completely. I believed that people like me, the wait staff, the cleaners, the people who move silently through the background of this city, were destined to remain invisible. She paused, looking out at the faces of the union workers who had started her crowdfunding campaign, sitting at a prime table near the front. But I learned something profound in the quiet moments of a hospital room, and later, in the absolute chaos of a restaurant floor, she continued. I learned that true power has absolutely nothing to do with bank accounts or job titles. True power is the choice to be kind when it is easier to be cruel. It is the choice to give a piece of yourself to a stranger simply because their life has value. The crowd hung on her every word. Because of your incredible generosity, not only is my mother receiving the world-class care she deserves at Oakwood Memory Care, but as of this morning, the Preston Foundation has fully funded the registration of over 50,000 new, diverse donors to the National Bone Marrow Registry. Abigail smiled, a genuine, radiant expression. We are turning a moment of extreme arrogance into a lifetime of second chances. Thank you. The applause was deafening, a roaring wave of genuine admiration and respect. Abigail stepped away from the podium, her heart full, entirely unburdened by the past. She had not sought vengeance against Arthur Pendleton. She had simply spoken her truth and allowed his own toxic gravity to pull him down. On the morning of October 12th, the day Arthur was scheduled to surrender himself to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, a cold, bitter rain washed over the city of Chicago. He was allowed one final hour before the federal marshals arrived to transport him to the penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. His public defender had agreed to meet him at a small, dingy diner a few blocks from the courthouse to finalize the surrender paperwork. Arthur sat in a cracked vinyl booth, the scent of stale grease and cheap bleach assaulting his senses. He wore plain gray sweatpants, and a shapeless cotton sweater. He looked down at the lukewarm cup of black coffee in front of him, watching the dark liquid ripple as the subway rumbled beneath the street. A small, older television model was mounted on the wall behind the counter, tuned to a mid-morning national news broadcast. Arthur wasn't paying attention until a familiar, hauntingly clear voice cut through the ambient noise of the diner. He slowly raised his head. There, on the screen, was Abigail Preston. She was sitting in a brightly lit studio, being interviewed by a prominent anchor about the massive success of her foundation's recent gala. She looked vibrant, deeply rested, and untouchable. "It's not just about medical logistics," Abigail was saying on the television, her dark eyes looking straight into the camera. "It's about recognizing that we are all fundamentally connected. Wealth, status, the illusion of superiority, those things can vanish in a heartbeat. The only real legacy we leave behind is how we treated people when we held the power." Arthur stared at the screen, unable to look away. He raised a trembling, age-spotted hand and pressed it flat against his chest, right over his sternum. Deep inside his bones, in the dark, microscopic hollows of his skeletal system, the marrow that Abigail had willingly given him was quietly, flawlessly doing its job. It was producing the healthy white blood cells that flowed through his veins, fighting off the chill of the diner, keeping his heart beating and keeping his lungs drawing breath. He was legally destitute. He was publicly disgraced. He was about to spend the next 8 years of his life locked inside a concrete cell, stripped of his name and assigned a number. But the ultimate, inescapable torture was entirely biological. He would survive the federal prison. He would live through the grueling sentence, the terrible food, the isolation, and the despair, entirely because of her. He owed his every waking second to the very woman he had called a failure in an apron over a single drop of water. He was a walking, breathing prisoner of his own unforgivable cruelty, carrying his savior's blood inside a body he no longer owned. The diner door chimed open, and 2 heavily armed federal marshals stepped out of the rain, their eyes scanning the room until they locked on to him. Arthur Pendleton slowly stood up. He didn't say a word. He walked away from the cold coffee, stepping out of the diner and into the back of the armored transport van, carrying nothing into the darkness but the heavy, rhythmic, inescapable heartbeat of his own hard karma. Power that relies on the degradation and humiliation of others is a fragile illusion, destined to shatter under the weight of its own arrogance. Arthur Pendleton believed his vast wealth elevated him above the rules of human decency, using his status as a weapon against those he deemed beneath him. Yet, true strength is not found in cruelty. It is found in the quiet, unyielding integrity of individuals like Abigail Preston. Armed only with the truth and a profound sense of self-worth, she dismantled a tyrant's empire simply by refusing to be silenced. The universe ultimately balances the scales with a devastating, poetic precision. The billionaire lost everything because he failed to recognize the humanity of the woman who literally kept him alive. In the end, cruelty is a heavy debt, and karma collects it with absolute, merciless accuracy.